what are your thoughts on what's been happening, the last few days, weeks, but what's been happening for such a long time here in this country and in the United States as well?
First of all, I just wanted to, express my sincere condolence to all the families across this country who have been impacted by the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. But it's utterly heartbreaking, what's happening right now. It's like, how do you deal with this? How are the families dealing with the trauma from the, not knowing that their loved one has been disposed of in a landfill, and that basically police have cited it as impossible to recover their loved one's remains. It's an important part of their healing and their mental health to be able to have a ceremony and have a proper burial for their loved one.
Yeah, it really is. And you're an advocate, so you work directly with communities and with families affected. What is some of the community and directly into the community, what are some of the people there saying about what's going on?
Well, there's a lot of talks about, that this is a human rights issue. It continues. When you look at, the inability of all levels of government to meet the basic human rights needs of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people, it's, really concerning that there's such a lack of action and effort to create those pathways for the safety and security of Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. But there's also a lot of fear in community. That we're dying at alarming rates across the country. We're experiencing violence at alarming rates. And, what amplifies that fear is the lack of police response as well. When we experience violence, there's a saying that goes with Indigenous women, girls, and to us people in this country that we're over-policed and under-protected.
Well, that's a really great saying, actually, now that you think about it. So there does seem to be a disconnect between in this case specifically, between the Winnipeg Police and the Indigenous community. Where do you think that disconnect lies?
I think, where that comes from is the structural and systemic racism that is deeply embedded within policing institutions and agencies. The lack of effort to really meet and address the needs of the Indigenous population when it comes to their safety and security is clearly demonstrated by the outcomes we're seeing right now with the Winnipeg Police.
So given what you just said and thinking of a more broader scope of things, what can be done? I know we've asked this so many different times throughout however many years in cases of this. What can be done?
Well, with the national inquiry, when it was, taking place and traveling coast to coast across the country, policing was problematic in every place where they had hearings and a lot of the testimony from family members and survivors and Two-Spirit and gender diverse people. And there are 11 specific calls related under the justice related to policing, that police have a responsibility to implement and act upon, because the 231 calls for justice are legal imperatives, and they have to ensure that, they have to look at their policies, their procedures, and the way that and their conduct as well, and there has to be accountability measures in place to deal with their conduct, but also accountability measures in place to see how they're implementing the 231 calls to justice that they're responsible for.
Well, just on that note, with the 231 calls to justice, I mean, there's been 11 Indigenous women in Winnipeg murdered this year, and I believe your family member is one, so my condolences to you.
Yeah, thank you.
So where I'm going with this is there's been 11 in Winnipeg. There's been, I think Stats Canada said last year there was 45 Indigenous women who died of police-reported homicide. Did you ever think that 3 years out from the end of the national inquiry that we'd be here with the numbers getting worse?
No, actually, when the national inquiry was launched and it was taking place across the country and the final report was released, I had a lot of hope for, a lot of change and for action, to build those pathways for safety and security for us as Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit people in this country. But there's such a lack of political will. Governments have a responsibility to act, and there seems to be some type of barrier in place from preventing them on acting on ending this genocide, and each day of inaction results in the continuance of murder, the continuance of this genocide.
Well, and they're called calls for justice, right? It's not, and it seems like I can't remember where I saw this, but I think I was speaking with Sandra Delarond about this, and I said they are calls for justice, not calls for hope. And a lot of people are saying right now it just seems like they're calls for hope. So you had touched on it a bit. How do we get governments involved? How do we get police to work on what's happening? How do we get people in general to make sure that these calls for justice are being implemented?
I think, they need to learn about the 231 calls for justice and where they fit in, and develop strategies and mechanisms and policies and procedures, and as well legislation on how to fully action the 231 calls for justice. But also, if they're not acting on the implementation of the 231 calls for justice, I think, we're at a place in Canada right now where, we have to shine a international human rights group's lens on the lack of action in relation to the safety and security of Indigenous women, girls, and to us people in this country.
Well, with what you just said, there's a call for a UN Special Rapporteur on the rights for Indigenous peoples to come in and sort of oversee what's going on here. Mm-hmm. Why is that so important that we have an outside look, especially from an international point of view, on what's going on?
Well, it's critical because, someone has to hold the Canadian government and other levels of government, like provincial, federal, territorial, and Indigenous governments accountable for acting in relation to the 231 calls for justice, because they're all legally obligated to act and implement the 231 calls for justice. And if they are not doing it, then we have to look at outside support, to put that pressure on Canada to act.
And when you see all of the Indigenous community come together, and I mean, there's been blockades at the landfill, I was speaking with Cambria about that, there's been so many different rallies and vigils and everybody coming together, does that maybe give you hope that something can change eventually, that people are caring about this, and it might not be sort of the right people right now, but with enough that it can change?
I think, actually, when I see community gather, like, it's actually heartbreaking, and it's sad that we have to continuously gather in numbers, to support families who have been impacted by the genocide that is occurring across this country. And each time we gather, it diminishes our hope because the numbers are increasing at alarming rates. So, I don't see a lot of hope in that, like when we're continuously gathering because we're dying at alarming rates. Right. I'd rather see us gathering in community celebrations, celebrating that our human rights are being met and that we're living good lives, we're living secure lives, and as Indigenous girls, they have the ability to dream and fulfill those dreams. That's what I see hope.
So is that what you see hope in then, is
Yes.
maybe the future of what could happen, and right now it's not, the best of times?
No, I think, like as an advocate, it's deeply concerning, the violence that we're experiencing, and systems that are supposed to protect us and respond to the violence are basically saying to Indigenous communities, it's your job, go figure it out on your own. That's very problematic. So I don't see it as hopeful. Like, I see it as
Right.
deeply concerning.
So in the immediate future, and specifically with the landfill searches, what do you think should be done as some next steps that could, I mean, there was a statement that went out yesterday of the UN Special Rapporteur and funds from the federal government. So what do you think should happen that these women are brought home and they do have a resting place?
I think, there has to be, obviously a feasibility, I'll say a feasibility action plan, because there's, you can't have any inaction when it comes to our Indigenous women, girls, and to us people, being cruelly taken and dumped in landfills. We need action. We need to ensure that those families who are impacted by, this horrific tragedy, that they're supported and that they have the closure and they are able to take their loved one home to their final resting place, surrounded in love and light and ceremony as well. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, we need resources in our communities, across this country and across Manitoba too. When we look at, the safety and security, we need to start at a very young age, where young Indigenous girls are, and to us people, and even boys are learning about like who they are. They're learning their language, their culture, their identity within their schools and their community. And there's programs and services, that really strengthen that family approach and that community approach, but also there has to be safety plans and education when our women and girls and 2S people are leaving our communities. We need to ensure that adequate resources are provided within communities, and even, you know, supports to women and girls and 2S people who are experiencing violence within our communities too. There has to be different, like whether it's shelters, you know, different types of programming, but often we see governments just supporting, you know, programming, but they're not supporting the infrastructure, the O&M, operation and maintenance, and also service delivery. You can't just piecemeal it. If you want success in communities, you have to ensure, you know, that the infrastructure is there, the O&M is there, and the programs are there, and that they're sustainable too. You know, our lives are not projects, and you often see governments funding very 1 to 2 year projects, and then you're continuously having to submit proposals, and I think that's unethical. You know, when it comes to our safety and security, they have to do better and provide long-term sustainable funding to our communities.
Well, Hilda, that's certainly well said. We're going to have to leave our conversation there, but that's not the end of the conversation, right? We'll always continue to work on this and bring this issue to the forefront. So I want to say a big thank you, Miigwech, to you for joining us and sharing some of what you have to say. So thank you, Miigwech.
Awesome. Thank you.